And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and regular listeners to the program will know that we cover the issue of student debt a lot on this show. Student debt has been estimated at between 1.2 and 1.3 trillion dollars, by some even slightly more. Total student debt in this country, it is a major issue. Our next guest has been mapping student debt. He's been on the program before, but they've just released the second part of their study on the geography and demographics of student debt. Marshall Steinbaum is research economist at the Center for Equitable Growth. He has a PhD from University of Chicago Department of Economics. He has been studying labor trends as well as the macro labor market, and now student debt. And Marshall, thanks for coming back on the program.
Glad to be back.
So your first, you and your co-author Kavya Vagul write that your first interactive study released, or interactive, whatever you call it, released this past December, revealed a relationship between income and delinquency by zip code. Now, I think you're saying that you've confirmed that there's a very racial component to student debt. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely right. We have three major findings from this episode of the research. Basically, first of all, that there's a strong racial component to student debt, sort of flat out, as you say. Minorities are much more likely to be indebted based on our zip code level analysis. And then more than that, even controlling for income. So when we look just at zip codes with similar incomes, minorities still disproportionately account for, or are disproportionately indebted. So, you might think that, given that we already know the economic segregation in this country is pretty substantial, there have been arguments that the student debt crisis and specifically the fact that it disproportionately affects minorities is just the result of higher poverty rates among minorities at lower incomes overall. But we find that that's not the case. And I would say our most surprising finding is, in fact, that the student debt crisis seems to be worst for middle-class minorities, based, again, on the zip code level analysis. If you look at the association between delinquency on student loans and race by income level, that relationship is most positive. So being having a slightly higher population share that's minority matters most in terms of a zip code's delinquency rate for middle income zip codes.
So before we just to jump in for a second, Marshall,
Sure.
Just to make sure we're all tracking together on this. So when I read your information, when I reviewed it, certainly it jumps out that there seems that these delinquency rates seem strongest for the black middle class, African American middle class. And I guess what struck me most about that, and you alluded to it just now, is that people might think, well, delinquency is associated with income levels, and minority folks tend to be poorer, so they're going to be more delinquent because they're poorer. But I interpret that, perhaps I'm misinterpreting your data, you'll tell me, but I interpret that to mean that independent of income, that an African-American middle-class family is more likely to be, or household is more likely to have a student debt problem than a white middle-class household, despite the commonality of income.
Yes, that's right. So that I would say that controlling for income, it's exactly as you said. The association of minority population share and delinquency remains, and not only that, it is most acute for middle incomes. That's what that's the sort of third finding that I'd like to highlight, because that says. So not only is the minority community disproportionately affected by student debt, but it's specifically at least borrowers who live in middle income zip codes. We interpret that as being middle income borrowers that are disproportionately affected by student debt among minorities.
So do you have any conclusions? Well, first of all, I asked you this question, I think, last time, and I ask other researchers on this program this question from time to time, but were you surprised by this finding?
I mean, on one level, yes, and on another level, no. The level that says, that is surprising is, we think that basically we've extended college attendance sort of down the income ladder. That it used to be a kind of elite preserve, and now it definitely isn't. And so you would find that the biggest problems are associated with the lowest income borrowers, and indeed that is what we found in the first map. But looking, slicing the data in this different way that specifically takes race, it's not quite so simple. And among minorities, it is the middle class that's most strongly affected by delinquency. That isn't surprising from the perspective of the housing crisis. I think
Okay.
we draw this analysis out in the study that we published, but in the basis in the late 2000s, effectively what had happened is, historically, Black communities had lacked access to any kind of credit for purchasing homes, and had therefore, by and large, not been homeowners. That changed especially in the 2000s with the housing bubble, but that did that and we had public policies in this country that encouraged people to take out loans to buy houses because it was seen as the route to the middle class, and that turns out to interact with longstanding racism, wealth gaps between minority and white households, at lack of access to good labor market outcomes, and sort of the fact that minorities tend to be the first victims when the labor market goes south, as it did during the housing crisis. Um, that
So
we saw then that it was, just exactly the sort of Black middle class that had some wealth tied up in housing that had the largest percentage decreases in wealth in the housing crisis. I saw some numbers last week, and I think these are pretty well undisputed, that something like half Black wealth in the United States was lost in the housing crisis. And you see similar things for Latinos in the survey of consumer finances
right,
that
not
tracks.
not so basically, Marshall Steinbaum, you are identifying two potential factors here leading to this higher rate of African American middle class student loan delinquency. One is the fact that many of these families had their wealth tied up in housing values, and African American communities have been harder hit by the housing crisis, the deflation in housing value, and slower to recover or haven't recovered at all, and Latino families as well. And the second being that minority populations, when it comes to labor, and you'll correct me, of course, because you're the labor economist, but my understanding is that African American communities in particular have been harder hit by the loss of jobs coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, and slower to recover employment in the wake of that crisis, right?
Yes, I agree with both of those statements. I want to just return to the housing to clarify exactly what I meant, because while I think you're right in what you said, Black families disproportionately lost wealth in the housing crisis. It's not just that I'm linking loss of wealth in the housing crisis to the current student debt crisis in the Black community, but I want to draw an analogy. That is, we induce through policy and by other means, taking on debt to purchase something expensive,
Mm.
that was thought to be the sort of ticket to middle class status. That this was a way into, a way in social mobility to financial security. And what was ignored in the housing crisis, as it turned out, was the longstanding reasons why uh, minority households are more exposed to economic risk. Likewise, in the student debt crisis, what I'm saying is, effectively policy has been that going to college and taking out debt to do it are the ticket to the middle class. Specifically, going back to this labor issue, if the labor market's bad and you can't find a job, a good thing to do with your time is go get a degree, perhaps from a for-profit provider, which
Hmm.
expanded dramatically during the financial crisis. Um, that's sort of that puts you in a good position for when things get better. Then you'll sort of have your foot in the door. And again, what we've seen is that something expensive financed with debt ends up, perhaps not just not helping minority households, but potentially actively harming them. That is,
You, you,
this dynamic is making racial inequality worse.
I think, thank you so much for that clarification, Marshall Steinbaum of the Center for Equitable Growth, because I think what you're saying there, or my interpretation, my reaction to what you're saying, is that you're really highlighting the issue of the social contract and the moral contract as it affects minority communities. In effect, that society, through policy, has made implicit promises to certain communities that if you the wise thing to do, the responsible thing to do to improve yourself is to invest in a home and the financial security that it provides, and then doing nothing to prevent a bubble from deflating and destroying that value or restoring the value once the bubble pops, and that is morally. And I'm restating what you're saying, so you're free to disagree what I'm doing. But and that likewise with student debt, that basically society through policy and other means said to minority communities, if you invest, go into debt in order to get an education, this will be good for you. We will encourage you to do so through policy and other means. And yet, when the time came to get the advantage of that, society was not interested in effect, honoring its part of the bargain or making its word good by making sure those jobs were available.
Yeah, I think that that is an excellent analysis of what's going on, and I would add that kind of in both cases, they're simplistic. Each
Sure.
fix, sort of imagines that racial inequality that is longstanding is unidimensional and can be solved through some sort of basically bestowing of some totem of middle class status, in which the financial risk is all placed on the individual.
Right. And
So
I
in
would.
both cases, you're basically not you. I'm sorry, not you personally, but the society, as you put it, is not apprehending the reasons why it has historically been very hard for minority households to accumulate wealth across generations in this country. As you say, particularly returning to the labor market as an issue, there's quite good evidence that discrimination against minorities persists in the labor market, and that it's not solved by getting more degrees. Not that as an excellent scholar of racial wealth inequality, Sandy Darity said, he wouldn't uh, say that this means that minority students should not go to college, because that's not to say that you can't get anything from higher education, but it is just a simplistic view of the reasons why racial inequality persists. And as I said, there's evidence about in the labor market that even holding constant a quality of college degree and major, in the sort of the canonical case now is a study from a little over 10 years ago, where the researchers basically sent fake resumes that were
Right.
entirely identical to employers, where the only difference was that the person's name was sort of typically black, as it were, or versus not typically black. So, that's something that where you couldn't tell the race just on the basis of their name. And the callback rate for the black resumes was substantially lower. And this is by construction, that is showing that the discrimination is still there, even when you hold constant all of the other variables that are supposed to be
Determine.
the ticket into the labor market.
Right, and I think I'm curious to get your thoughts on this as well, Marshall Steinbaum. I would say that the two solutions you describe, whether it's invest in housing or get an education, and borrow to do both, they are not only simplistic, but I would argue that they are inherent. They were presented during the debates at the time as sort of neutral, bipartisan,
Yeah,
technocratic solutions to a problem.
yeah,
I would argue that they are, in fact, deeply, as well as simplistic, deeply ideological in that
yeah,
they suggest that private sector kinds of solutions that really and are the answer, and that somehow it's just something you need to do, not the society as a whole, but it's a
yeah.
shortcoming you need to overcome in yourself. Am I?
Right.
You
Yeah. I
agree
mean,
with
I,
that?
I think that you couldn't be more right about that, especially when it comes to higher education. I call this idea the education myth. I mean, I just made that up. But basically, it's a very if education is the only difference between people who do well and do poorly in life, then that has the baggage loaded onto it that your outcomes are of your own making, and it is a very effective way of blaming the victim for economic misfortune. And so we've, on the one hand, policy encourages sort of formal education, or I mean, and the means of or the types of higher education have proliferated in recent years, because there's all this ideological baggage, exactly as you say, onto the idea that people can control their own outcomes, and the whole point there is to, I would say, repudiate society's obligation to, say, run the economy
Right.
in a way that employs all the people who want to work.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that's very well said, and it leads into opens up all sorts of other doors and avenues for discussing these issues, which I wish we had time for, frankly, but unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up. But Marshall Steinbaum, research economist at the Center for Equitable Growth, your studies on the mapping of student debt are co-authored with Kavya Vagul are extremely interesting. I hope there's more to come, and I hope you'll come back and join us again.
Thank you. I would love to, and thanks again for inviting me today.
Our pleasure.